They say a building is only as strong as its foundation, but standing 50 stories above Minneapolis, I realized I'd spent 30 years building steel monuments while my own home was rotting from the inside out. My name is Thane Garrison, a 55-year-old senior project manager who has spent 3 decades defining the skyline of the Midwest. My life has been measured in blueprints, load-bearing capacities, and the cold, unyielding precision of architectural-grade steel. My professional portfolio is worth $28 million, a figure built on the fact that I never missed a measurement, never tolerated a flaw, and never ignored a hairline crack in a support beam. But as I leaned against the glass of the observation deck of the Obsidian Tower, my latest crown jewel, the cold wind whistling through the seams of the newly installed panels, felt like a warning I'd ignored for far too long. For over a decade, I've been a ghost in my own life. I'm the kind of man who knows the thread counts of the Ritz-Carlton sheets in 5 different time zones better than the pattern of his own bedspread. I've sacrificed the warmth of a dinner table for the sterile efficiency of a construction site office, convincing myself that the money was a shield, a structural reinforcement for the family I left behind in Edina. I told myself that my wife, Alara, understood the cost of the Garrison legacy. I told myself my daughter, Leanie, was proud of the towers her father raised. I believed that as long as the money kept flowing and the foundations remained level, the inhabitants of my life were safe and satisfied. I was a master builder, after all. I knew how to manage stress, how to compensate for shifting soil, and how to ensure everything stayed upright. I didn't know it yet, but the most dangerous structural failure of my career wasn't happening in the steel beams above me. It was happening in the silence of my own living room. I checked my gold watch, a heavy $26,000 weight on my wrist that felt more like a shackle than an accessory. Today was supposed to be the victory lap. I was wrapping up a grueling 3-week stint on a Denver skyscraper project, and my mind was already drifting toward the flight home. Tomorrow was my 26th anniversary with Alara, 26 years of her being my anchor while I sailed into every storm that promised a higher profit margin. She deserved more than just roses this time. She deserved the man she married, not the project manager who merely visited her between deadlines. In my carry-on bag, I had a luxury sapphire necklace, a piece of jewelry that cost more than most people's homes. I was convinced that this shimmering blue stone would somehow fill the hollow spaces I'd left in our marriage. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a sharp, insistent vibration that broke my reverie. It was a notification for a missed call and a voicemail from Alara's phone, recorded at 3:14 inches the morning the previous night. My thumb hovered over the screen. I hadn't heard the phone ring in my hotel room. I'd been dead to the world after an 18-hour shift. When I hit play, there was no greeting. There was no "I love you" or "happy anniversary." There was only a hollow, static-filled silence, followed by the sound of muffled, desperate crying. My heart hammered against my ribs, a rhythmic thumping that sounded like a pile driver on a hollow site. Behind the sobbing, there was a second sound, a voice. It was a low, flat stranger's voice, a whisper so cold it made the hair on my neck stand up. I played it again, pressing the phone to my ear until the plastic ached against my skin. The voice said 3 words: "Just drink it." The wheels of the Gulf Stream slammed onto the tarmac in Minneapolis with a violence that matched the storm in my chest. I didn't wait for the stairs to fully settle before I was out of the cabin, the crisp Minnesota air biting at my lungs like a serrated blade. Jerry, my driver, was standing by the black SUV, but I didn't give him a chance to open the door. I snatched the keys from his hand without a word, my eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the horizon. I threw myself into the driver's seat, and the tires shrieked as I peeled away from the private hangar, leaving a cloud of white smoke in the moonlight. I merged onto Highway 62, weaving through the late evening traffic with a reckless precision I usually reserved for high-stakes site inspections. The 3 A.M. voicemail looped in my head, a haunting soundtrack of muffled sobs and that low, flat command. As I turned into the gated community in Edina, the SUV bumping over the curb, my heart sank. Our house, a sprawling custom build I'd designed to be a sanctuary, was too dark. Usually Alara had the entire facade illuminated, warm gold spilling from every window to welcome me home. Tonight, only a single, flickering light in the upstairs hallway offered any sign of life. I slammed the brakes and barely waited for the engine to die before I was at the front door. My hand reached for my keys, but I stopped. The door was unlocked. In a household as security-obsessed as ours, an unlocked door was the equivalent of a collapsed load-bearing wall. I pushed it open, dropping my leather bags on the marble floor with a hollow echo that seemed to vibrate through the entire house. I was immediately hit by a heavy, medicinal smell, antiseptic and stale tea that didn't belong in my home. It was the scent of a hospital, not a haven. "Alara? Leanie? I'm home early," I called out, but only the wind whistling through the chimney answered me. I moved toward the living room, my boots clicking rhythmically against the hardwood. I found her there, sitting in a high-backed velvet chair, staring out at the garden we had planted together. My wife, Alara, 52 years old, looked like a ghost of the woman who once commanded every room she entered. She was wearing a deep emerald designer gown that hung off her frame as if she had shrunk 3 sizes in 3 weeks. Her skin looked gray and translucent, almost papery under the dim recessed lighting. "Happy anniversary, sweetheart." "I brought the red ones," I whispered, stepping into her line of sight with a bouquet of roses I'd grabbed at the airport. She flinched away as if I were a stranger, her eyes glassy and unfocused. She didn't look at the flowers. She looked through me. Who are you?" she rasped, her voice a fragile shadow of the melodic tone I loved. "No visitors tonight." "She says no visitors." The roses hit the floor, red petals scattering like blood on the white marble. I reached out, taking her dry, cold hand in mine, desperate for a spark of recognition. As I pulled her sleeve back slightly to find her pulse, I froze. There were deep, circular bruises hidden under the silk of her sleeve, looking like someone had held her down with a grip of iron. The woman who once ran an international art gallery with an iron will couldn't even recognize her own husband, but the bruises on her wrist told a story that her lips couldn't find the words for. The sharp click-clack of designer heels against the marble foyer cut through the silence like a jackhammer. Standing there was Leanie, my 25-year-old daughter. Her eyes were filled with a concern so polished, so practiced, it should have been my first warning sign. She froze for a heartbeat, her hand tightening around a leather folio. "Dad, you weren't supposed to be home until tomorrow," she said, her voice dropping into a register of well-rehearsed sorrow. She was across the room in a blur of silk, physically stepping between me and Alara, effectively breaking the contact I was trying to establish. Before I could ask about the bruises, before I could demand an explanation for the smell of rot in our house, Leanie was already delivering the blow. "It's early onset, Dad. Doctor Boyd says it's aggressive. I've been doing everything myself for the last month so you could focus on the Denver build. I didn't want to break you while you were managing that skyscraper project." I stood there, watching my daughter reveal that she had already obtained a temporary power of attorney while I was away. She claimed it was medically necessary for immediate treatments, a legal bypass she had engineered while I was 3 states away. I watched her movements, noting how she treated Alara like a broken piece of furniture rather than a mother. Her touch was efficient, but devoid of any warmth. "Don't push her, Dad. You'll just trigger another episode. Overstimulation at this hour leads to sundowning symptoms," Leanie whispered, her eyes fixed on mine with a hardness that didn't match her words. She produced a thick folder, the crinkle of medical-grade paper filling the room as she showed me pills and schedules. She dismissed the bruises I saw as simple clumsiness, from a loss of motor control, a side effect of the aggressive decline. I looked back at Alara, but she was already being guided toward the stairs by Leanie. I felt the aggressive coldness of the house settling into my bones. Diagnosis: Alzheimer's. My mind screamed one word: lie. I have spent my life reading blueprints, looking for the one weak point that could bring down $100 million investment. There was a structural failure in Leanie's story, a hairline crack she hadn't managed to plaster over. After they went upstairs, I walked over to the hallway table and opened the medical folder she'd left behind. My eyes locked onto the signature of the prescribing physician, Dr. Kenneth Boyd. My blood turned to ice. I remembered that name. 5 years ago, I had blacklisted Kenneth Boyd from a major construction site for forging safety inspections and taking kickbacks from contractors. He was a man who would sell his soul for a decimal point in the right place. And suddenly, the bruises on Alara's arm didn't look like clumsiness anymore. They looked like a crime scene. I looked up at the darkened stairs, realizing that the fortress I had built for my family was now a prison, and I had just handed the keys to the warden. Sleep doesn't come to a man who specializes in structural integrity when he suspects his own family's foundation is built on shifting sand and lies. I lay fully clothed on the guest room bed, the room Leanie had graciously prepared for me, staring at the ceiling fan as it sliced through the stagnant air in a hypnotic, useless rhythm. The guest room felt like a containment unit. My clothes had been moved here from the master suite, neatly folded but stripped of their place in my own home. It was a tactical relocation, a way to keep the contractor away from the site of the crime. I've spent 30 years analyzing the internal hum of buildings, but tonight, I was tuned to the internal hum of the Garrison estate. Every groan of the floorboards and hiss of the air conditioning was analyzed with a project manager's precision. I couldn't stop thinking about Boyd. A man like Kenneth Boyd didn't just stumble into a family tragedy. He was invited, usually by someone with something to hide. My mind drifted back 6 months, back to the minor cracks I'd ignored because I was too busy looking at blueprints for the Obsidian Tower. I remembered the dinner parties where Leanie had introduced us to her new circle. Specifically, a man named Ethan Clark. Ethan was 30, with a smile that was a little too bright and a handshake that felt like a sales pitch. He was a wealth management specialist, or so Leanie claimed. I recalled the way they looked at each other not like lovers, but like partners in a high-stakes merger. At the time, I'd been pleased that Leanie was finally taking an interest in the family legacy, in the $28 million I'd worked so hard to accumulate. I didn't know it yet, but Ethan Clark wasn't there to manage our wealth. He was there to audit our expiration dates. As I reached for the door handle to inspect the hallway, my hand brushed against the metal. I froze. The sharp, metallic scent of the hallway smart locks was new. I realized then that Leanie had replaced all the original hardware on Alara's room and my own office with digital locks that only she could control via an app on her phone. She hadn't just secured the house. She had partitioned it. She had turned my sanctuary into a series of locked cells. It was 1:45 a.m. when the first movement broke the stillness. I heard the distinct click of a door and soft, rhythmic footsteps, the kind of practiced creep that suggested this wasn't the first time. I opened the guest room door an inch, the cold floorboards biting against my bare feet. A shadow moved across the blue glow of a distant nightlight in the hallway. It was Leanie. She didn't turn on the main lights, which was my first red flag. A doting daughter caring for a sick mother in the middle of the night usually needs to see what she is doing. I watched as she slipped into the master bedroom, the door sealing shut behind her with the soft electronic beep of the new lock. I started a mental countdown. 1 minute, 5, 10. My mind looped through the possibilities, but none of them sat right. What could she be doing in there for 20 minutes in total darkness? I crept down the hall, my heart a dull hammer against my ribs, until I was standing right outside the door that used to lead to my private world. I pressed my ear to the wood, straining to hear over the roar of my own blood. I expected to hear Alara coughing or Leanie whispering words of comfort. Instead, I heard the crinkle of plastic. Then, the rhythmic, bone-chilling scratch of something being dragged across the floor. Finally, 40 minutes after she entered, the latch clicked. Leanie emerged, nearly jumping out of her skin as she saw me standing in the hallway shadows like a gargoyle. Her doting daughter persona vanished for a split second, the grief-stricken mask replaced by a sharp, defensive hostility. "What were you doing in there for 40 minutes, Leanie?" I asked, my voice a low, analytical rasp. She didn't even blink. She stepped toward me, her face inches from mine, the smell of her expensive floral perfume cloying in the small space. "Assisting with an accident, Dad. Something you wouldn't know anything about since you were too busy building towers in Denver to care about your wife's dignity. She needs a catheter. She needs specialized care. Care I'm providing while you stand here playing detective." Her eyes weren't blue anymore. They were cold, hard steel, reflecting a version of my daughter I didn't recognize. She wasn't finished. Before I could demand to see Alara, she pulled a folded paper from the pocket of her robe, a pre-signed medical directive. "This states that your presence distresses the patient in her current state. Doctor, Boyd signed it yesterday. If you interfere again or try to force your way into that room, I have the legal authority to have you removed from this house tonight. Go back to your room, Dad. You're a guest here now." I looked at the paper, then at the girl I'd raised, and realized I was standing on a site that had already collapsed. She wasn't just taking care of her mother. She was building a cage, and she had just handed me the eviction notice for my own life. I spent the rest of the night in the kitchen, waiting for the first gray streaks of dawn. Have you ever looked into the eyes of your own child and realized you were looking at a stranger with a blueprint for your destruction? I began to sift through the remains of our family's life in the trash. The silence of the house was absolute, yet it shrieked with the weight of the secrets I was unearthing. I pulled the heavy plastic trash bags from the bin, the rustle echoing in the cavernous room like thunder. Digging deeper, past the coffee grounds and the takeout containers, I found a crumpled notice from a high-stakes underground casino in Street Paul. It was a collection demand for a $150,000 personal loan. The name on the note wasn't mine. It was Leanie's. My daughter, the girl I had provided everything for, was bleeding money into a void. Beside the notice lay 3 empty glass vials. They weren't the Alzheimer's medication Leanie had shown me earlier. They were a powerful sedative, something used in clinical settings to induce a state of twilight sleep. The realization hit me with the force of a falling girder. This wasn't healthcare. This was a chemical leash. Leanie was financing a gambling addiction with her mother's vitality, using a crooked doctor to keep the source of funds compliant and quiet. By 8 a.m., I was in the breakfast nook, watching Alara try to eat. The rattle of a silver spoon against a china bowl was the only sound in the room. Her hands, once capable of restoring delicate oil paintings, were now trembling, blue-veined things that couldn't even manage a mouthful of oatmeal. Leanie sat across from her, scrolling through her tablet with a detached efficiency. "People don't just disappear while they're still breathing, Leanie," I said, my voice thick with suppressed rage. Leanie didn't even look up. "It's a degenerative condition, Dad. Maybe if you'd been here, you wouldn't be so surprised." She spoke as if Alara were a faulty appliance, an inconvenience to be managed rather than a woman to be loved. I couldn't stay in that room. I needed to see Alara in the sun, away from the medicinal gloom of the house. I helped her into the garden, her body feeling as light and fragile as balsa wood. We had only taken a few steps across the manicured lawn when her muscles simply gave out. She collapsed against me, a dead weight that I barely managed to catch. Alara wasn't just sick. She was a skyscraper whose support beams were being sawn through in the dark. I lowered her onto a stone bench, looking into her eyes. For a split second, the fog cleared. "Thane," she whispered, her voice a ghost of a rasp. "Make it stop. Please. The tea. It tastes like metal." The clarity broke my heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. "I'm going to fix this, Alara. I promise." As I gathered her into my arms to carry her back inside, my hand brushed against the hem of her designer gown. I felt something small and hard hidden in the stitching. I reached in and pulled out a miniature digital recorder. It had been crushed, the plastic casing splintered, and the internal chips snapped with deliberate force. Alara had tried to record someone, and she had been caught. I looked up at the house. Leanie was standing at the second-story window, watching us. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just closed the curtain. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for my wife's health. I was fighting an operative who had already mapped out the entire war. If I was going to save Alara, I had to stop being a father and start being the man who built the city cold, calculated, and ready to demolish anything that stood in the way of the structure's safety. I adjusted my tie in the reflection of the clinic's glass doors, smoothing out the rage that threatened to crack my professional veneer. The antiseptic sting of the air hit me instantly, a sharp chemical contrast to the smell of wood smoke and autumn I'd left outside. I wasn't there for a consultation. I was there to perform a site inspection on the man who was dismantling my wife's mind. I walked across the linoleum, the squeak of my rubber soles echoing like a warning. A cold, efficient receptionist tried to block my path, her eyes fixed on a digital monitor. "Mr. Garrison, you can't just walk back there," she said, her voice a flat monotone. "The doctor is with a patient." I didn't stop. I leaned over her desk, just enough to let her see the authority I'd honed on 40 construction sites. I reminded her that I was the primary health insurance holder and the legal spouse. I scanned the layout while she scrambled to make a call. The place didn't feel like a neurological center. It felt like a private clubhouse, hushed, over-decorated, and designed to keep the outside world at a comfortable distance. Within minutes, the man himself appeared. Dr. Kenneth Boyd stood behind a mahogany desk that likely cost more than a nurse's yearly salary. He projected an air of manufactured empathy that I found revolting. He began recycling the same Alzheimer's script I'd heard from Leanie, citing atypical rapid onset and high-stress triggers. I sat there, my hands clasped tightly in my lap to hide the tension. "How much does it cost to buy a doctor's signature in Minneapolis, Kenneth?" I asked, my voice a low, dangerous rumble. He didn't flinch, but his eyes shifted to the cold glass of the office window. "I build skyscrapers. I know when a report has been doctored to hide a structural failure. I want the raw data. I want the digital lab results, not the photocopies Leanie showed me. There's been a server glitch, Thane. It's temporarily locked the records. I'll email them to you later tonight," he replied with a smile that never reached his predatory eyes. It was a lie I'd heard 1,000 times from crooked contractors, and it confirmed everything. I allowed him to escort me toward the exit, playing the part of the frustrated but defeated husband. But I didn't leave the building. I ducked back into a small alcove near a side employee entrance, my heart hammering against my ribs. I waited. 10 minutes later, I spotted a flash of familiar blonde hair. Leanie was walking through that side door, bypassing the waiting room entirely. I watched as she greeted Dr. Boyd in the hallway. Then, she touched him. Not a daughter's touch, a lover's. She reached out and adjusted Boyd's collar with a proprietary flick of her fingers, and they shared a look of familiar, predatory intimacy that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just a medical conspiracy. It was a partnership. "Is he gone? Did he buy it?" I heard her whisper, the hush of their conspiracy carrying clearly in the quiet corridor. Boyd chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "He's suspicious, Leanie. We need to accelerate the timeline." He reached into his lab coat and handed her a fresh batch of unlabeled vials. "Here, sweetheart. Keep her steady." I didn't know it yet, but steady was their code for a chemical coma. My own daughter was standing there receiving a chemical arsenal from a man she was sleeping with to destroy the mother who had given her everything. Seeing my daughter's hand on that man's chest made my stomach turn, but it gave me the one thing I needed: a target. I sat in the silence of my SUV afterward, the Minneapolis skyline taunting me with its orderly beauty. The image of Leanie and Boyd was burned into my retinas like a welding flash. My daughter was no longer just a doting caretaker. She was an operative in a coordinated assault on the woman I loved. I needed eyes where I was blind. I needed a recording that couldn't be disputed by a disgraced doctor's forged medical charts. I pulled up to a nondescript storefront in Bloomington, nestled between a specialized plumbing wholesaler and a high-end data recovery firm. The shop had no flashy neon signs, just a small etched plate on the glass. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of solder and static. A young clerk with tired eyes looked up from a circuit board. "I need 2 4-hour remote access, encrypted server storage, and no physical lights on the units," I said, my voice cutting through the electronic hum. He recognized me. "Mr. Garrison, I saw your latest tower project." I ignored the pleasantry, my focus purely tactical. "This isn't for a nursery kid. I'm securing a high-value asset against a persistent threat." He nodded slowly, then dropped a bombshell. He mentioned that a young woman matching Leanie's description had been in the store 3 weeks ago, asking specifically about the effective range of high-frequency signal jammers. My skin crawled. Leanie hadn't just been planning a poisoning. She had been researching how to blind me before I even knew there was a fight. She was 2 steps ahead of me because she had been planning this while I was still worried about the wind load on the Obsidian Tower. I meticulously selected my arsenal: 4K micro cameras disguised as smoke detectors, a phone charger for the kitchen, and a nondescript digital alarm clock for Alara's nightstand that looked identical to the one she'd owned for years. I paid in cash, ensuring no digital paper trail would ever alert the family accountants or the daughter who watched them like a hawk. My phone vibrated, Leanie's name flashed on the screen. I took a breath, letting the project manager persona slide over my rage like a protective shroud. "Hey, sweetheart," I said, my voice steady. "I'm just tied up reviewing site permits. I'll be back for dinner. Mom is resting, Dad. She's so much better when it's just the 2 of us." "Don't rush back," she replied, her voice saccharine. The black bag of cameras on the passenger seat felt heavier than 100 tons of structural steel. It was the weight of proof. As I walked back to the SUV, I opened the demo app on my phone to test the receiver sync. A notification popped up immediately, showing an active, unauthorized Bluetooth signal broadcasting from the undercarriage of my own vehicle. My heart stopped. It was a localized tracker, a small magnetic leech fed by my own car's battery. My daughter hadn't just occupied the house, she'd turned my own tools against me. I didn't head straight for the driveway. Instead, I pulled into a muddy construction site 2 miles away. I crawled under my own SUV with a flashlight between my teeth to rip out the digital parasite. The metallic tang of the flashlight casing was bitter against my tongue, a reminder of the foul game I was now forced to play. I located the tracker near the rear axle. I didn't just smash it. I saw a long-haul delivery truck idling near the side entrance, and with a calculated flick of the wrist, I attached the tracker to its chassis. "Follow that truck to Street Paul, Leanie," I whispered. "I'm going off the grid." I had exactly 30 minutes before Leanie's specialist session with Alara was scheduled to end a window narrower than the tolerances on a high-speed rail line. I drove a secondary route and parked 3 blocks away under the cover of a weeping willow. I entered the estate through the wooded perimeter, slipping through the basement utility door. I ascended the stairs, moving with the silence of a man who knew every joist and beam of the house he'd paid for. I reached the master suite. The smell of cedar oil Alara loved was still there, but it felt tainted now. "Forgive me, Alara," I thought. "I have to be your eyes because they've stolen your own." My hands were trembling as I fitted the 4K lens into the alarm clock. Sinking. 10%. 50%. Done. I moved to the kitchen, installing the disguised charger camera. I was the architect of this house, but today, I was its ghost. I made one final sweep of the master bedroom, checking for anything Leanie might have missed. My fingers brushed against a hidden latch I'd built into the back of the nightstand drawer years ago. I slid it open, expecting a diary, but my breath hitched in my throat. I found a stack of pre-filled death certificate drafts. Everything was there. Her name, her date of birth, the cause of death listed as cardiac arrest, secondary to neurodegenerative complications. Everything was filled out in black ink except for the final date of passing. My own daughter had already planned the funeral while the body was still warm. Suddenly, the gravel crunched in the driveway. Leanie was home early. I was still standing in the middle of the master bedroom with a handful of my wife's death warrants, and the front door was already clicking open. I shoved the death warrants into the small of my back, the sharp edges of the paper biting into my skin like a jagged piece of shrapnel. I didn't have time to find a better hiding place. I snatched a hand towel from the ensuite rack, turning toward the door just as it swung open with that predatory, electronic screech. Leanie stood in the doorway, her frame backlit by the harsh hallway LED, her eyes narrowing as they swept over the room. She wasn't looking at me. She was scanning the furniture, checking the displacement of the air, looking for the one thing that didn't belong. "What are you doing in here, Dad?" she asked. Her voice wasn't the sweet, melodic tone of the girl I'd taught to ride a bike. It was the cold, clipped bark of an auditor. I wiped my palms on the towel, forced my breathing into a steady, rhythmic pattern, and leaned against the dresser. I was looking for my old watch, the one Alara gave me for our 10th. "I thought it might be in the nightstand," I said, my voice projecting a weary, aging confusion I didn't feel. "I forgot where you moved everything." She stepped into the room, her eyes lingering on the alarm clock I'd just rigged with a 4K lens. My heart hammered against the death warrants in my waistband, but I kept my face a mask of tired defeat. She walked right up to me, her expensive perfume, the one I'd bought her for Christmas, smelling like a funeral wreath. "I told you, Dad, this room is a sterile environment now. Dr. Boyd was very clear. Your presence, your clutter, it triggers Alara's cortisol levels. You're making her worse." She reached out and adjusted my collar, a gesture that felt less like an act of love and more like a check for a hidden wire. "I think it's best if you stay at the Hyatt tonight. I've already called the concierge. Your bags are in the foyer." I felt the floor drop out from under me. She wasn't just partitioning the house, she was evicting me. "This is my home, Leanie. I built these walls." She let out a short, sharp laugh that chilled my marrow. "You built the walls, but I own the locks, remember? I have the power of attorney, Dad. And if you don't go quietly, I'll have to call the police for a wellness check. Not for Mom. For you. I've already told the neighbors you've been acting erratic, confused. It would be a shame if the board of your company heard the Great Thane Garrison was losing his grip. I didn't know it yet, but this was the first phase of the demolition, stripping the owner of his title before the wrecking ball swung. I didn't argue. In construction, when a site is compromised, you don't stay and fight the collapse from the inside. You retreat, set up a perimeter, and analyze the debris. I picked up my bags in the foyer, feeling like a refugee in a kingdom I had funded with 30 years of my life. As I walked out to my SUV, I didn't look back at the second-story window. I knew she was there, watching me through the curtains, waiting for the taillights to fade so she could return to her work. I drove to a grimy, pay-by-the-hour motel 3 miles away. I couldn't go to the Hyatt. It was too public, too easy for her to track. I needed a dark corner where I could be a ghost. The motel room smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap bleach, a far cry from the $28 million life I had cultivated. I sat on the edge of the sagging bed, pulled the death warrants from my back, and spread them out under the flickering light of a bedside lamp. My hands were finally shaking. I opened the app on my phone. The 4K feed from the alarm clock flared to life. It was 9:45 p.m. The screen was crystal clear. Alara was lying in bed, her eyes half open, her breathing shallow. She looked like a bird with a broken wing, pinned to the silk sheets. Then, the door opened. Leanie entered, followed by Ethan Clark. Ethan wasn't wearing his corporate suit anymore. He was in a tactical fleece, looking less like a wealth manager and more like a scavenger. "Is the old man gone?" Ethan asked, his voice crackling through the phone's speaker. "Checked into the Hyatt like a good little boy," Leanie replied, her voice dripping with a casual malice that made my stomach turn. She walked over to the nightstand inches from my hidden camera and picked up a glass of water. "He found the bruises. He's smarter than Boyd gave him credit for." Ethan shrugged, leaning against the bedpost where I used to rest my head. "Doesn't matter. The merger goes through on Tuesday. Once your mother passes from natural complications, the Garrison Trust dissolves into the shell company. Your father will be fighting lawsuits for the next decade. He'll be too broke to care about an autopsy." What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about the daughter I had raised. Leanie reached into her pocket and pulled out a porcelain mortar and pestle. I watched, paralyzed by a clinical horror, as she began to unpack several distinct types of pills from a nondescript plastic bag. She wasn't just giving Alara a sedative, she was a chemist of misery. She began to grind the pills, the rhythmic, bone-chilling scratch of the porcelain echoing in the quiet motel room. "Dr. Boyd says the scopolamine levels need to be higher," Leanie muttered, her focus absolute. She was too lucid today. She almost talked to him in the garden. "Just don't overdo it yet," Ethan warned, checking his watch. "We need her heartbeat steady until the papers are signed tomorrow. We need that thumbprint." I watched as Leanie stirred the white powder into a cup of dark tea. She sat on the edge of the bed and forced Alara to sit up. My wife tried to resist, her hand trembling as she pushed weakly at the saucer. But Leanie was relentless. She held the cup to Alara's lips with a tenderness that was more terrifying than a blade. "Drink it all, Mom. It's for your memory," Leanie whispered. I felt a cold, lethal focus settle over me. I wasn't watching a medical treatment. I was watching a slow-motion execution. But it wasn't just the poisoning that broke me. As Alara drifted back into a drug-induced stupor, Ethan and Leanie didn't leave. They sat at the small table in the corner of the room, the same table where Alara and I used to have our morning coffee, and they opened a bottle of my 1945 vintage wine. They began to laugh. They were celebrating. Ethan pulled a laptop from his bag and started showing Leanie real estate listings, villas in the south of France, penthouses in Dubai. They were spending my life's work while my wife's heart was being chemically strangled 10 feet away. "What about the father?" Ethan asked, swirling the red wine in a crystal glass. "He's a loose end." Leanie leaned back, a cold smile playing on her lips. "I've already taken care of that. I've been funneling small amounts from his personal accounts into Dr. Boyd's offshore holdings for months. By the time the police look into Mom's death, the paper trail will lead straight to Dad's mercy-killing plot. He'll be the one in the jumpsuit, Ethan. Not us." The room seemed to tilt. She hadn't just planned to kill Alara. She had built a secondary structure to bury me alive. She was framing me for the very murder she was committing. My own daughter was using the financial blueprints I had taught her to build a cage for her own father. I looked at the death warrants on the bed. I looked at the 4K feed of my wife, dying in the dark. I realized that my legal options were gone. If I went to the police, Leanie's paper trail would trigger, and I'd be arrested before I could even explain the cameras. I was trapped in a demolition of my own making, and the wrecking ball was already in the air. I stared at the screen as Ethan reached into his bag and pulled out something else, a small, professional-grade syringe and a vial of clear liquid. He didn't use it. He just set it on the nightstand, a silent promise for a Tuesday that was fast approaching. I didn't know it yet, but I wasn't the only one watching that house. A sudden, sharp knock at my motel door made me jump, the phone nearly slipping from my hands. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. No one knew I was here. I moved to the door, my hand closing around a heavy brass lamp I'd unplugged from the wall. I looked through the peephole, expecting to see a cop or one of Ethan's associates. Instead, I saw a woman I hadn't seen in 5 years. A woman who knew exactly how to dismantle a man like Kenneth Boyd. My thumb hovered over the lock, the 4K feed still hissing in the background as Leanie started to sing a mocking lullaby to her mother. The war was no longer just about survival. It was about who could burn the blueprints first. I opened the door, the brass lamp still gripped in my hand like a club. Standing in the fluorescent flicker of the motel hallway was Special Agent Christine Parker. 5 years ago, she was the lead investigator on a federal racketeering case I'd helped break wide open. Back then, she was a woman of sharp suits and cold facts. Today, she looked like she'd been through a war zone. Her trench coat was damp from the sleet, and her eyes held the kind of exhausted clarity you only see in people who spend their lives staring into the abyss. "Put the lamp down, Thane," she said, her voice a low, gravelly rasp. She didn't wait for an invitation. She pushed past me into the room, her eyes immediately locking onto the death warrants spread across the bed and the glowing 4K feed on my phone. She didn't look shocked. She looked like she'd finally found the missing piece of a very ugly puzzle. "How did you find me, Christine?" I asked, my voice cracking. "I've been tracking Ethan Clark for 18 months, she said, pulling an encrypted tablet from her bag. "He doesn't just manage wealth, Thane. He's a liquidator for a shadow syndicate that targets high-net-worth estates with aging or vulnerable matriarchs. They call it the Orchard. They find a weak point in the family, usually a child with a debt or a vice, and they move in like termites. By the time the house falls, there's nothing left but sawdust and a funeral." She sat on the edge of the sagging motel chair, the blue light of her tablet reflecting in her eyes. "We knew Ethan was in Minneapolis. We didn't know his point of entry was your daughter until your personal account started pinging our red flag system 4 hours ago. You're being drained, Thane, not just of your money, but of your identity." I felt the air leave my lungs. I showed her the phone screen, where Leanie was currently pouring a second glass of my 1945 vintage, laughing while my wife lay dying in the next room. "She's framing me, Christine. She's moving money to Boyd's offshore accounts in my name. She's building a cage for me." Parker looked at the screen, her jaw tightening. "It's worse than you think. Ethan Clark isn't the boss. He's the contractor. The man who hired him, the man who bankrolled Leanie's gambling debt to trap her, is Howard Barnes." The name hit me like a physical blow. Howard Barnes was my personal attorney. He had been my best friend for 20 years. He was the godfather to Leanie. He was the one who had drafted the very trust they were now dismantling. I realized then that the structural failure wasn't just a crack in a beam. The entire ground I was standing on had been excavated months ago. Howard knew every lock, every account, and every weakness I had. He wasn't just helping them. He was the architect of the demolition. I didn't know it yet, but I wasn't just fighting for Alara's life. I was fighting against a man who knew exactly how to make me disappear without leaving a footprint. "Why now?" I whispered, staring at the feed. "Why this Tuesday?" Parker tapped her tablet, bringing up a series of leaked internal memos from Barnes's firm. "Because your Obsidian Tower project is set for final appraisal on Wednesday. If Alara passes on Tuesday, the Garrison Trust triggers a mandatory liquidation clause. Barnes and Ethan will be able to sell your shares of the tower for pennies on the dollar to a front company they own. They're not just taking your 28 million, Thane. They're taking the skyline." We watched the screen together in a silence so heavy it felt like it was crushing the motel room. On the feed, Ethan Clark stood up and walked over to Alara's bed. He picked up the syringe he'd left on the nightstand, the one filled with the clear, lethal promise of a natural stroke. He didn't use it yet. He just held it up to the light, tapping the side of the plastic casing to move a small, translucent bubble of air to the top. "One bubble, Leanie," Ethan said, his voice reaching us through the phone with terrifying clarity. One tiny pocket of air. It's the perfect demolition. No chemicals to trace, no trauma. Just a sudden, inexplicable blockage. A stroke in her sleep. The doctor signs the certificate we call the funeral home, and by Wednesday morning the garrison name is just a memory. Leanie walked over, her face illuminated by the bedside lamp. She reached out and touched Alara's cheek, not with love, but with a terrifying curiosity, like a child poking a dead insect. Will she feel it? Only for a second, Ethan replied. Like a sharp pinch, then nothing, just silence. My hand gripped the edge of the motel table so hard the cheap wood splintered under my fingernails. I wanted to scream, to run out the door and drive through the gates of my estate like a battering ram. But Parker grabbed my arm, her grip like a vice. If you go there now, Thane, you die. Or you go to prison for the rest of your life, she hissed. They have the power of attorney. They have the police in their pocket. If you show up unannounced and erratic, Ethan will use that syringe on you and claim self-defense. You're a builder, use your head. You don't stop a collapse by standing under the falling concrete. You find the support beams and you cut them. I looked at the 4K feed. Alara's eyes suddenly flickered. She wasn't fully awake, but she was fighting the twilight sleep Leanie had forced her into. Her hand moved, grasping at the air, her fingers brushing against the alarm clock where my camera was hidden. She was looking right at the lens. It was as if, in her drugged haze, she knew I was there. She knew I was watching. Her lips moved, forming a silent word that didn't need a microphone to be understood. Help. I'm coming, Alara, I whispered to the empty motel room. Parker stood up, her professional mask firmly back in place. I have a tactical team 40 minutes out, but we can't move until we have proof of the syndicate's involvement. We need Howard Barnes's ledger, the one he keeps in the floor safe of his private study at your estate. He moved it there for safekeeping while you were in Denver. I looked at her, a cold, strategic fury beginning to replace my grief. I designed that house, Christine. I know exactly how to get into that study without triggering a single sensor. But we have a problem. Ethan mentioned a second team. Who are they? Parker's face went pale. The orchard doesn't like loose ends. If the liquidation doesn't go perfectly on Tuesday, they send in cleaners. Professional hitmen who specialize in making entire families look like they died in a tragic gas leak or a house fire. If we don't end this tonight, no one walks out of that house alive. I looked back at the screen. Leanie was leaning in close to Alara's ear, whispering something that made my wife flinch even in her stupor. Don't worry, Mom. Dad will be joining you soon. He's already bought the plot right next to yours. He just doesn't know it yet. The betrayal had reached its peak. My daughter had spent her life as the light of my world, and now she was the one dimming the sun. I reached for my jacket, the weight of the sapphire necklace, still in my pocket, a gift for a woman who might not live to see the morning. I didn't know it yet, but the man I was about to become wasn't the man who built the obsidian tower. He was the man who was going to tear it all down to save the only foundation that mattered. We left the motel, the sleet turning into a blinding whiteout. As we approached the gates of my estate, the 4K feed on my phone suddenly flickered and went dark. A notification popped up. Signal jammed. Leanie had found the first camera. The house was now a black box. I was blind. The syndicate was inside, and the cleaners were on their way. My heart was a drum against my ribs as I stepped out into the snow, looking at the dark silhouette of the home I had built. I realized then that I wasn't just entering a house. I was entering a grave, and only one of us was coming out. The silence of the garrison estate was a physical weight, a thick, suffocating blanket of snow and betrayal that seemed to swallow the very sound of my footsteps. I didn't use the front door. I didn't use the garage. I moved through the skeletal trees of the perimeter, my boots sinking into the fresh powder, until I reached the northwest corner of the foundation. I had built a service crawl space here 20 years ago, a narrow, concrete-lined artery designed for emergency pipe maintenance that bypassed every motion sensor and door contact in the house. As I squeezed into the dark, damp space, the smell of wet earth and cold stone filled my lungs. Above me, I could hear the faint, rhythmic hum of the HVAC system, the heartbeat of the house I'd designed to be perfect. But as I navigated the tight turns of the ductwork, I felt a tremor in my hands that had nothing to do with the cold. I was a man who lived by the rule of the level and the plumb line. But tonight, My entire world was tilted at a lethal angle. I reached the access panel beneath Howard Barnes's private study. I had built this room as a sanctuary for him, a place where we'd shared expensive scotch and discussed the future of the Garrison legacy. Now, it was the vault where he kept the blueprints for my execution. I pushed the panel aside and rose into the room like a ghost, the scent of old leather and mahogany mocking me. The room was dark, save for the blinking red light of a high-frequency signal jammer sitting on the desk. That was why my cameras went dark. Leanie wasn't just guessing, she was sweeping the house for my eyes. I didn't head for the safe immediately. My eyes caught a stack of folders on the desk, blueprints, but not for a building. They were for the obsidian tower. I flipped through them, my heart stopping as I saw the red ink scrawled across the structural sections. Howard hadn't just been planning to steal the tower. He had been documenting every minor shortcut, every slightly off-spec beam, and every cost-saving measure I'd ever approved in 30 years. He wasn't just going to take my money. He was going to destroy my reputation as a builder. He was going to make sure that even if I survived, I would be remembered as a fraud. I didn't know it yet, but the man I called my brother had been collecting my sins for 2 decades, waiting for the perfect moment to bury me under them. I moved to the floor safe, hidden beneath a Persian rug. My fingers flew over the dial. I knew the code. It was the date. Alara and I got married, a date Howard had toasted to 100 times. The heavy steel door clicked open with a sound like a bone snapping. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, the kind of old-school record-keeping a man like Howard used because he didn't trust the cloud. I flipped it open, and the world finally collapsed. It wasn't just a debt ledger. It was a diary of a demolition. Howard had documented every conversation he'd had with Leanie since she was 18. He hadn't trapped her into a gambling debt. He had encouraged it. He had introduced her to the high-stakes world, groomed her to resent my absences, and fed her a steady diet of poison until she saw me as a target instead of a father. He had been the architect. She was just the wrecking ball. And then I saw the final entry, dated only 3 days ago. L, ready. A is a shell. T is in Denver. Tuesday is the end. Cleaners confirmed for 0300. I checked my watch. It was 2:14 a.m. I had 46 minutes before the cleaners arrived to erase the evidence. 46 minutes to save my wife before Ethan Clark used that air bubble to turn her heart into a hollow chamber. I slipped out of the study, the ledger tucked into my jacket. I moved toward the master suite, my heart a frantic hammer against my ribs. I reached the door, my hand closing around the cold metal handle of the new smart lock. I didn't have the code. I didn't have the app. I was a builder locked out of his own room while a murder was being performed on the other side. I didn't hesitate. I didn't call for help. I used the only tool I had left, my knowledge of the house's structural flaws. I moved to the hallway linen closet, pulled back the cedar shelving, and exposed the master bedroom's secondary firewall. It was a weak point I'd always meant to reinforce a gap in the framing where the wiring for the smart home system ran. I kicked the drywall with everything I had, the sound of the impact muffled by the thick insulation. 1 kick. 2. The wood splintered. I reached through the gap and manually disengaged the electronic bolt from the inside. The door swung open. The room was bathed in the sickly blue glow of the master bath's nightlight. Ethan Clark was standing over Alara, the syringe in his hand, the light reflecting off the deadly, translucent bubble of air. Leanie was sitting in the velvet chair, her back to me, watching her mother with a detached, clinical focus that made my skin crawl. "Do it now, Ethan," Leanie whispered. "I can't stand the way she's looking at me anymore." "I'm here, Alara," I roared, lunging into the room. Ethan spun around, the syringe raised like a weapon. Leanie screamed, a jagged, ugly sound that broke the silence of the house. I didn't go for Ethan first. I went for the woman who had sold her soul for a penthouse in Dubai. I grabbed Leanie by the shoulders, my grip so tight I felt the expensive silk of her robe tear. "Is this what I raised you for?" I hissed, my face inches from hers. "To be a scavenger in your own mother's bedroom?" She didn't look ashamed. She didn't look sorry. She looked at me with a pure, concentrated hatred that I felt in my marrow. "You didn't raise me, Thane. You built towers. You were a name on a check and a voice on a satellite phone. You left her alone, and you left me with Howard. He's my father now. He's the one who stayed." The words hit me harder than any physical blow. The realization that I had provided the materials for my own destruction, my absence, my ego, my obsession with the skyline, was the rock bottom I hadn't seen coming. I had built the city, but I had left my own daughter's heart as an empty lot for a monster like Howard to build on. Ethan moved then, lunging at me with the syringe. I dodged the needle, the plastic tip grazing my neck, and sent a heavy right hook into his jaw. He hit the floor hard, the syringe skittering across the marble toward the bed. I didn't wait for him to get up. I grabbed the heavy brass lamp from the nightstand, the same one Alara had picked out for our anniversary 5 years ago, and brought it down on the signal jammer, crushing the electronic parasite into a heap of sparking glass and wire. What happened next changed the power dynamic of the room forever. The moment the jammer died, the house's security system rebooted. The sirens didn't go off, I'd disabled those, but the silent alarm I'd hardwired into the foundation years ago, a system Leanie didn't even know existed, triggered. Every light in the house flared to a blinding, industrial white. The smart locks on the windows and doors engaged, turning the estate into a hermetically sealed box. "The house is locked, Leanie," I said, my voice dropping into that cold analytical tone I used for failing project sites. "The FBI is 4 minutes out. Agent Parker has the ledger. She knows about Howard. She knows about the orchard. And she knows about the cleaners. Coming at 3. Leanie's face went from rage to a pale, frantic terror. She looked at the door, then at the windows. She was trapped in the very fortress she thought she owned. Ethan scrambled to his feet, reaching for a heavy glass award on the dresser. But he stopped as the sound of a helicopter began to thump over the lake. "You're a builder, Dad," Leanie spat, her voice trembling. "You don't know how to destroy things. You're too obsessed with the structure." I looked at my wife, who was staring at me with a flicker of recognition through the drug-induced haze. I looked at the daughter who had tried to bury me. "You're wrong, Leanie," I said, reaching into my pocket and pulling out the sapphire necklace. I didn't give it to Alara. I dropped it on the floor, the heavy stones clicking against the marble. "I'm the one who designed the demolition protocol for every building I ever raised. I know exactly where the pressure points are, and I just pushed the button." But as the first tactical teams began to repel from the roof, a sharp, metallic click came from the hallway. It wasn't the FBI, it was the cleaners. They were early, and they didn't care about the ledger or the trust. They were here to ensure that no one, not even Leanie, left the Garrison estate to tell the story. I didn't know it yet, but the final twist wasn't about who would win the money. It was about who would survive the fire. A soft hissing sound began to fill the room through the vents. The smell of natural gas. The cleaners weren't coming with guns. They were coming with a match. The hiss was the sound of a death sentence. To a master builder, that specific pitch, the high-frequency whistle of pressurized gas forced through a ventilation system, is the sound of a structural nightmare. It's the sound that precedes the orange flash that turns steel and stone into a graveyard of glass and ash. The cleaners weren't just here to kill us. They were here to perform a total erasure. A house fire in an affluent neighborhood, a tragic accident involving an aging patriarch and his sick wife. It was a clean, final chapter that would leave no witnesses for the FBI to interview. I looked at the vent above the master bed. The faint, oily scent of mercaptan, the additive that gives natural gas its telltale rotten egg smell, was already beginning to coat the back of my throat. My heart wasn't just beating, it was a rhythmic warning of a clock ticking toward 0. I looked at Alara, her eyes fluttering as the gas began to displace the oxygen in the room. I looked at Ethan, who was currently staring at the vent with a look of slack-jawed, paralyzed terror. "They were supposed to wait," Ethan screamed, his voice cracking like dry timber. "I was supposed to get the code for the offshore account first. I didn't know it yet." But Ethan Clark had just realized he was a line item that had been marked for deletion. Leanie stood frozen in the center of the room, her hands over her mouth. The daughter who had boasted about owning the locks was now realizing that those locks were what would keep her trapped in the furnace. She looked at me, her eyes wide, the predatory steel I'd seen earlier dissolving into the raw, terrified pupils of the child I'd once taught to swim. "Dad, what do we do?" she whispered. "Now I'm Dad again?" I spat, the words bitter in the thickening air. I didn't have time for her epiphany. I lunged for the bedside table and grabbed a heavy porcelain pitcher of water. I smashed it against the edge of the dresser and soaked a handful of silk pillowcases in the cold water. I threw one to Leanie, Cover your mouth. Get Alara into the bathroom and seal the door with wet towels, now. In a crisis, a project manager doesn't panic, he prioritizes. I had 3 variables to solve: the gas, the cleaners, and the lockdown. I had sealed the house to keep the traitors in, but now I had turned my own home into a gas chamber. I ran to the hallway closet, my lungs burning as I navigated the thickening atmosphere. I didn't go for the stairs. I went for the central HVAC control panel hidden behind a false back in the linen closet. My fingers flew over the interface. I didn't try to shut the gas off at the source. The cleaners had likely bypassed the external meters. Instead, I bypassed the fire safety protocols I'd installed myself. I reversed the airflow. I didn't just want to stop the gas. I wanted to blow the pressure back into the vents, using the house's massive industrial-grade blowers to push the fumes back toward the entry points where the cleaners were waiting. As the blowers roared to life with a deep, subsonic thrum that shook the floorboards, I heard a muffled explosion from somewhere in the basement. The reversal had worked. The gas, trapped in the narrow lines, had ignited at the point of entry. The house shuddered, a low-frequency groan vibrating through the structural steel as the foundation absorbed the shock. What happened next changed the geography of the house forever. I ran back into the master bedroom. Ethan was gone. The coward had managed to slip out through the drywall gap I'd made, likely trying to save himself before the FBI arrived. Leanie was on the floor by the bathroom door, coughing, her silk robe stained with the soot of the small fire that had started in the vents. She was holding Alara, who was remarkably lucid for a woman who had been chemically strangled for weeks. "Thane," Alara whispered, her hand reaching for my face as I knelt beside them. Her touch was weak, but the recognition in her eyes was like a flare in the dark. The safe. The real safe. I froze. "What are you talking about, Alara?" She looked at Leanie, a look of profound, agonizing pity on her face. "Leanie, you thought you were stealing the trust, but I moved it. 6 months ago, I saw what Howard was doing to you. I saw the way you were looking at the bank statements." Leanie's face paled. You knew? "I'm your mother, Leanie," Alara rasped, a tear carving a clean line through the soot on her cheek. I didn't want to believe it. I hoped I was wrong. I hoped that if I gave you enough rope, you'd pull yourself back from the edge. But you just used it to tie the knot. Alara revealed a truth that Howard Barnes hadn't accounted for in his orchard blueprints. She hadn't been a passive victim. She had noticed the missing funds from her gallery accounts and, instead of confronting me, she had built her own demolition protocol. She had created a secondary, private trust that required a dual authentication biometric scan, one from her and one from me. The 28 million that Ethan and Howard were fighting for, it was an empty shell. The real fortune was locked in a digital vault that only Alara and I could open. I didn't know it yet, but Alara had been playing a much longer game of survival than even I had. "Howard, he'll kill us," Leanie whimpered, the reality of her failure finally sinking in. "He promised the syndicate that the money was a sure thing. If they find out the trust is empty, they won't just let us go. He's already trying to kill you, Leanie," I roared as a second explosion rocked the house, this one closer. The fire was spreading through the insulation. "The gas was for you, too. You were a loose end the moment you signed that power of attorney." The sound of shattering glass erupted from the foyer below. The cleaners weren't waiting for the gas anymore. They were coming in to finish the job manually. I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of tactical boots on the marble stairs. I looked at the layout of the bedroom. We were trapped. The balcony was 60 feet above the frozen lake, and the hallway belonged to the killers. My mind raced through the blueprints. I had built this house to be a sanctuary, but I had also built it to be a maze. "Into the closet," I commanded. "Dad, that's a dead end," Leanie cried. "Not if you know how it was built," I said. I pushed them into the walk-in closet, a room the size of a small apartment. I pulled a hidden lever behind the shoe rack, a feature I'd installed for Alara's jewelry collection, and a section of the back wall slid open to reveal a narrow, vertical service shaft. It led straight to the garage, bypassing the main hallways. "Go, both of you," I said, pushing the wet silk pillowcase into Leanie's hands. "Stay low. There's a panic room in the garage foundation. It's reinforced concrete. It can survive a total collapse. Go. What about you?" Alara grabbed my arm, her eyes full of a sudden, fierce protectiveness. "I have to find Ethan." And I have to make sure Howard doesn't leave this property, I said, my voice hardening. I'm the builder, Alara. I'm the only one who knows where the house is weakest. I watched them disappear into the dark shaft. The moment the panel clicked shut, the master bedroom door was kicked off its hinges. 2 men in matte black tactical gear entered, their suppressed submachine guns sweeping the room with a mechanical, predatory efficiency. They didn't see me. I was flattened against the wall behind the heavy velvet curtains. I didn't have a gun. I had a heavy brass lamp and the knowledge of every electrical circuit in the room. As the lead cleaner moved toward the bed, looking for a body to confirm the kill, I reached out and yanked the heavy silk cord of the curtains. The massive brass rod, weighted for the heavy velvet, came crashing down. It didn't kill him, but the distraction was enough. I lunged out, swinging the lamp with every ounce of the rage I'd been suppressing. It caught the second man in the temple, sending him sprawling. I didn't stay to fight. I dove through the gap in the drywall I'd made earlier, tumbling into the hallway just as a burst of suppressed fire shredded the curtains where I'd been standing. I was running through a house that was literally eating itself. The fire in the vents was spreading, the smoke thickening into a black, oily veil. I reached the top of the grand staircase and looked down. There, in the center of the foyer, stood Howard Barnes. He wasn't in a tactical suit. He was in his expensive cashmere coat, looking like he was waiting for a ride to the airport. He was holding Alara's jewelry box in one hand and a silenced pistol in the other. He looked up at me, a look of profound, disappointed sorrow on his face. "You always were too proud of your foundations, Thane," Howard called out over the roar of the fire. "But you forgot the most basic rule of architecture. Nothing lasts forever. Everything eventually returns to the earth." "Where's Ethan, Howard?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the hollowed-out space. Howard smiled a cold, thin expression that held no warmth. "Ethan was a contractor, Thane. And like all contractors who fail to meet a deadline, his contract was terminated. He's in the basement. He'll be part of the ash." He raised the pistol, aiming it directly at my chest. I looked at the man I had called my brother, the man who had groomed my daughter to be a killer, and I realized that the only way to save my family was to finish the demolition. I didn't know it yet, but the house wasn't the only thing with a self-destruct sequence. I reached for the fire suppression manual override on the wall beside me. It wasn't a water system. I had installed a high-pressure Halon gas system for the art gallery in the basement, a system that extinguished fire by stripping all the oxygen out of a room in seconds. "Goodbye, Howard," I whispered. I hit the switch. The high-pitched whine of the Halon release began to fill the foyer, but as the white gas began to pour from the ceiling, Howard didn't look at the vents. He looked at the front door. A third party had just arrived at the Garrison estate, and they weren't the FBI. What happened next was a reversal so violent it made the fire look like a candle in the wind. The Halon gas hit the foyer like a spectral white tidal wave, an invisible thief that began to strip the oxygen from the very air Howard was breathing. In the high-pressure hiss of the discharge, I saw the confusion on his face turn to a primal, gasping panic. He dropped the jewelry box, the sound of Alara's diamonds spilling onto the marble lost in the roar of the suppression system. He tried to raise the pistol, but his lungs were already collapsing into a vacuum. I retreated further into the smoke of the upper hallway, utilizing a small emergency oxygen mask I had stashed in the linen closet, a precaution for the high-altitude designs I'd spent my life perfecting. Through the white haze, the front doors of the Garrison estate didn't just open. They were detonated. The reinforced oak shattered inward as a team of men moved in, not the tactical units of the FBI, but the Red Vault enforcers. They weren't here for a rescue or a cleanup. They were the apex predators of the syndicate, and they looked at Howard Barnes not as a partner, but as a liability that had failed to deliver a $28 million return on their investment. I watched from the shadows of the landing as the lead enforcer, a man with a face like scarred granite, stepped over the threshold. He didn't even flinch at the Halon gas. He was wearing a professional-grade rebreather. He looked at Howard, who was crawling toward the door, clawing at his own throat. The enforcer didn't offer a hand. He reached into his coat and pulled out a digital tablet, showing Howard a real-time feed of the empty shell trust Alara had mentioned. "The money isn't there, Howard," the enforcer's voice boomed, distorted by his mask. "You promised us a liquidation. You promised us the Garrison legacy. All you've given us is a burning house and a federal investigation." Howard tried to speak, his face turning a sickly shade of purple. But the enforcer simply stepped on his hand, the hand that was still reaching for the spilled jewelry. I didn't know it yet, but the final reversal wasn't coming from the law. It was coming from the very monsters Howard had invited into our lives. "The orchard doesn't forgive a bad architect," the enforcer whispered. He raised a suppressed weapon, but before he could pull the trigger, the entire north wall of the foyer erupted in a secondary explosion. Agent Christine Parker and her federal tactical team had arrived. The flashbangs turned the world into a blinding white strobe, and the sound was a physical blow that knocked me back against the railing. The foyer became a kill zone of crossfire and chaos. I didn't stay to watch the syndicate fall. I moved with a desperate, animalistic focus, navigating the burning hallway toward the service shaft where I'd sent Alara and Leanie. I reached the garage just as the cleaners who had been in the basement were being intercepted by Parker's perimeter team. I found the hidden latch for the panic room, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hit the code. The heavy steel door swung open, and I saw them, Alara, sitting on a crate of emergency supplies, her eyes wide with a terrifying lucidity, and Leanie, curled in the corner, her face buried in her hands. "It's over," I rasped, the Halon and smoke finally catching up to my lungs. "The FBI has the house. Howard is. He's done." Leanie looked up, and for the first time in my life, I saw the true weight of what she had done reflected in her eyes. It wasn't just greed anymore. It was the realization that the new father she had chosen, Howard Barnes, had tried to turn her into ash the moment the money vanished. She reached out toward me, her voice a broken whimper. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't think he'd kill you." "You didn't think at all, Leanie," I said, my voice as cold as the concrete walls surrounding us. "You just saw a shortcut to a life you didn't earn. You traded your mother's soul for a seat at a table that was already being dismantled." The transition from the burning ruins of our home to the sterile, blue-lit halls of the federal courthouse felt like a slow-motion descent into a different kind of hell. The trial of Leanie Garrison and Ethan Clark became a national spectacle, a family revenge story that the media picked over like vultures. I sat in the front row every single day, my back as straight as a structural beam, watching the daughter I had raised be dissected by the law. The defense tried to play the neglected child card. They tried to paint me as the villain, the absentee billionaire who had pushed his daughter to the brink. But then Agent Parker took the stand. She didn't offer opinions. She offered the 4K footage. The courtroom was silent as the monitors showed Leanie meticulously crushing those pills into Alara's tea. The jury watched her smile as she held the cup to her mother's lips. They watched her celebrate with Ethan while Alara lay dying 10 feet away. But the final blow, the one that truly demolished the defense, came when the prosecution played the audio from the hidden recorder Alara had stashed in her room. It wasn't just a recording of the crime. It was a recording of the intent. "Once she's gone, and the old man is in jail for it, we'll sell the Obsidian Tower shares." Leanie's voice echoed through the courtroom, cold and vibrant with ambition. "I want to watch them tear it down, Ethan. I want to watch his precious legacy turn into a parking lot." The jury didn't even need 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. As the judge handed down the sentence, 22 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole, Leanie didn't look at me. She didn't cry for mercy. She just looked at the handcuffs, her face a mask of bitter, unrepentant silence. I watched her being led away, the metallic click of the door closing behind her, sounding like the final strike of a wrecking ball. The Garrison name was dead. The legacy was in ruins. 1 year later, the world is a much quieter place. I stand on a stone balcony in Tuscany, the smell of lemon trees and warm earth a sensory balm for a soul that spent too long in the smoke. Alara is beside me, her health fully restored, though she still carries a slight tremor in her hands, a permanent reminder of the chemical war she survived. We aren't the Garrisons anymore. We've taken her maiden name, living as ghosts in a village that doesn't care about skyscrapers or $28 million trusts. I pulled the last letter from the federal prison out of my pocket. I hadn't opened it. I didn't need to. I could feel the weight of it, the final, desperate attempt by Leanie to find a way back into the foundation she had tried to blow up. I placed the envelope on the stone railing. "Do you want to know what she says?" I asked Alara. She looked at the sunset, her eyes bright and focused. "No, Thane. Her voice doesn't live here. Not anymore." I picked up a heavy marble bookend and brought it down on the envelope, crushing it against the stone. Then, I fed the paper into a small portable shredder, watching as the ink of her lies turned into harmless white confetti. I tossed the scraps into the valley wind, watching them vanish into the Italian dusk. I've retired from building skyscrapers. I realized that my true masterpiece wasn't the Obsidian Tower or the Minneapolis skyline. It was the Alara Protocol, the global foundation we built with the remains of the trust. We've helped over 5,000 families secure their elderly relatives from the orchards of the world. We've turned our private tragedy into a public shield, ensuring that no daughter can ever use a doctor's signature as a weapon again. I didn't know it yet, but the strongest structure I ever built was the one I made after my life fell apart. People ask me if I regret the revenge. They ask if it was worth losing my daughter to save my wife. I tell them the same thing every time. It wasn't revenge. It was a structural repair. You don't negotiate with rot. You don't try to reason with a foundation that has already given way. You remove the infected timber, you clear the site, and you build something that can actually withstand the storm. When I look at Alara now, watching her paint the rolling hills of Tuscany with a hand that no longer shakes, I know I made the right choice. My name isn't on the buildings anymore, but my soul is finally level. The blueprint. If you see a crack in your family, don't ignore it because you're too busy. The foundation. Trust is earned, not inherited. The demolition. Sometimes the only way to save the house is to let it burn and start over with the truth. I'm Thane Garrison, the man who built the city, but finally learned how to build a home. The project is complete. The structure is sound, and for the first time in 55 years, I am finally, truly at rest.